Okay, I assume that the world is out there and that we are ready to go. My name is Margaret Summers, and I am not Cornelia Staritz. I am Margaret Summers from the University of Michigan, and I'm facilitating this session. And I'm very pleased to have such a wonderful dialogue about to take place before us. The name of our panel is From the Globalization Trilemma to the Political Trilemma of a Social-Ecological Transformation. And it's going to be a dialogue between Dani Rodrik from Harvard University and Andreas Novy from who is director of the Karl Polanyi Center in Vienna. Dani Rodrik, whom many of you I'm sure are familiar with, is the Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. And he is also president-elect of the International Economic Association, which that's a very interesting association. He's very well known for his research on globalization, economic growth and development, as well as political economy itself. And his current work, and he's involved in many organizations along these lines, his current work focuses on how to create more inclusive economies in developed and in developing societies. Andreas Novy, as I said, is director of the International Karl Polanyi Society in Vienna, and also part of the Vienna University School of Economics, if I've got that a little bit not quite right. But they are each going to speak. First, Dani's going to speak for 10 minutes, and then Andreas is going to respond. Actually, Andreas is going to say something first, but before I turn it over to him, I want to encourage everyone in the audience to feel free to write questions in the Q&A icon. The chat icon is not available for the audience, just the Q&A icon. So if you have questions right off the bat, start putting them in there, and then after our speakers are done, I'll have our speakers address the questions. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Andreas. He's going to introduce the substance of the panel. Andreas?
Yeah, thank you very much, Margie. First of all, thank you very much for jumping in so spontaneously, but because Cornelia Staritz, who would facilitate the event, had a serious health issue in her family and cannot attend, and she's very sad about this. But that said, I want to say a few words before handing over the word to Dani. The idea of this panel is indeed a dialogue, as Peggy said, between the very well-known Globalization Trilemma and my attempt to think a step further and in line of Karl Polanyi's thinking. And yeah, and that's why we have a very simple structure of this the coming hour, starting with Dani right now answering, and then myself, and then a dialogue. And that said, I hand over the word to you, Dani. Thank you very much for participating, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Hello, good morning to everyone. I hope you can hear and see me. It's a great pleasure to be with you and at this Polanyi conference. The trilemma that I was asked to talk about is roughly 2 decades old. It was first produced for a collection of articles that the American Economic Association's Journal of Economic Perspectives put out in the year 2000. And we were all given the task to sort of, speculate about the future of some aspect of the economy, and my task was to speculate about the future of the global economy. And I thought that sort of as I thought about the issues, the trilemma sort of emerged out of my thinking about the choices that we faced as we configure and reconfigure the global economy. And in many ways, of course, the trilemma is an application of Karl Polanyi's views and vision to our contemporary circumstances. And it's many ways an interpretation of Polanyi to what at the time was purely a kind of an economics audience. Now, I remember as I was writing that article that I'm not even sure I mentioned Polanyi at all. Sort of basing the trilemma on Karl Polanyi probably would have been the sure way to kill any interest in the economic profession on the trilemma. So instead, I used as my starting point the open economy macroeconomics trilemma, which is very familiar to international economists. And I presented this as a kind of an extension of that more familiar to economists trilemma. But this is really very much a kind of, it's very much Polanyi at work. You can see on the screen what the trilemma is, that you cannot simultaneously have hyperglobalization and nation state and democracy, all three of them at the same time. You have to pick 2 out of the 3. And depending on which 2 we pick, we have a kind of a different configuration for how the world economy is organized. And I need to spend a little bit of time as I explain this as to sort of what in particular the term hyperglobalization means. Because I think it's an extreme form of hyperglobalization where, in fact, these tensions and the trilemma really arises. So I want to define very carefully what I mean by hyperglobalization, because that will also clarify that more moderate versions of globalization could be entirely compatible with democracy and the nation state. And I think Andreas's argument will be somewhere along those lines as well, I believe. But hyperglobalization refers to a kind of a textbook model of full economic integration, a world economy where national borders effectively have no significant, they don't pose any barrier or any transactions cost to the flow of goods, assets, perhaps even people and services. So it's a world in which the global market is no different, if you will, than a national market or a domestic market. There are no more differences across national borders than there are across municipal borders within a country. Now, when we think about sort of what, and now to see what a hyper-globalized world economy like that might be simultaneously incompatible with democracy and the nation state, let me highlight what such a hyper-globalized world economy would require, what it would require of nation states, for example. So first and most obviously, nation states would be unable to restrict any the flow of goods at the border. So they wouldn't be unable to impose any restrictions on goods, services, and assets at the border. So no border barriers. But that's not enough. Nation states would also have to harmonize their monetary, legal, and regulatory regimes to the extent that those differences impose transactions costs on international trade and investment. So, for example, that's sort of one reason why eventually the European Union went to a single currency, because different currencies and the volatility of national currencies was perceived to effectively be a source of uncertainty, a transactions cost on the flow of international capital, international trade. So full single market integration required not just kind of an acquis communautaire, common regulations, but also single money. And third, that in fact, it's not even enough to just harmonize your national legal, regulatory, and monetary regimes. It also, you must incredibly commit yourself to doing so. So it's not, in the case of monetary policy, for example, it was enough simply to say that we will have fixed exchange rates, because if there is any uncertainty that the value of the peg might change down the line, that's still going to be a source of uncertainty. That's why effectively the euro was created, to eliminate any residual uncertainty or transactions costs associated from the presence of national monies. So we must credibly pre-commit to not to deviate from these harmonized national regimes. Now, when you look at it, at the requirements of hyperglobalization, the institutional and regulatory requirements of hyperglobalization in that way, it becomes quite clear that it's incompatible with institutional diversity, institutional pluralism around the world, because to maintain those different regulatory arrangements, different monetary regimes, different fiscal regimes, different tax regimes, you would have to require to have transactions costs, because otherwise the logic of hyperglobalization, the logic of arbitrage, would mean that differences in regulations and social models would effectively be undermined through the free flow of goods, services, and capital. Obviously, we see this most directly in the area of international corporate taxation, where we've had a kind of a decline, a global decline in corporate taxes, because low corporate tax jurisdictions have been a source of attraction for capital and paper profits, making it much more difficult for higher tax jurisdictions to maintain those higher corporate taxes. But the same type of arbitrage makes it difficult to maintain different product standards, different labor standards, different labor market institutions, social insurance regimes, the kinds of issues that the most hyper-globalized part of the world economy, namely the European Union, has faced on a day-to-day basis to ensure that a single market is truly upheld. Now, the tension between institutional diversity and hyperglobalization or globalization remains manageable when economic integration is relatively limited, so we don't push either towards the full hyperglobalization end, or when in fact regulatory differences among the constituent units remain rather small. So for example, within the United States, which is a federal entity, there are many of the same tensions, but they're kept in check because the regulatory differences across different nation states, or tax differences across different states within the United States, are relatively limited, and that ensures that you don't face this tension to its fullest extent. Similarly, under a different model of globalization, the Gatt Bretton Woods model, where economic integration was rather limited to border barriers and did not reach deep into national regulations, and the mobility of capital was much more limited than it is today, you could have significant amount of globalization, but it was a relatively shallow globalization that did not bring this tension to the fore between hyperglobalization on the one hand and institutional diversity on the other. Hyperglobalization, very importantly, does require a state, And in a world that's divided into different nation states, it requires nation states to provide the institutional and legal underpinnings of free markets, because markets always require those legal and institutional underpinnings. But importantly, it would have to be a nation state under hyperglobalization that provides only the public goods that are required to keep markets open and freely functioning. So those would be the standard institutions of property rights, contract enforcement, monetary and financial stability. But it would be a kind of a nation state that imposes no cost on the free flow of goods or capital across borders, and therefore does not attempt to maintain institutional arrangements and tax regimes that differ significantly from those in the trading partners. So the implication for that, and that's where now we come to the tension with democracy, is that such a nation state would have to be willing to sacrifice all economic, social, and political objectives other than the eliminations of transactions costs associated with jurisdictional boundaries. And therefore, such states effectively become the instruments and beneficiaries of hyperglobalization and unresponsive to other social objectives. And obviously this is problematic for democratic regimes insofar as democratic deliberation in different political units may require divergent policies or institutional arrangements. So let me close by emphasizing here what the real tension between democracy and hyperglobalization is, which is a bit subtler than the usual argument, because the usual argument says that, well, because globalization requires global rules, global governance, and that's necessarily going to limit what the nation state does, and therefore there is an immediate tension between globalization and the nation state. That is not entirely right, because there are circumstances under which it's perfectly democratically legitimate for nation states to restrict what they can do. And just as in the domestic context, there is a principle of democratic delegation that the executive or the elected body can actually delegate powers to, let's say, an autonomous body, and there's nothing necessarily undemocratic about that. That would be, sort of under the principles of democratic delegation. It could also be the case that a nation state could delegate certain powers to an international body or to an international trade agreement without necessarily sacrificing democracy. But the argument that globalization can actually enhance democracy through that way by actually countervailing some of the failings of democracy, which is what democratic delegation is supposed to do, does not imply that it will always do so. And there's a very big difference in principle and in substance between the pursuit of hyperglobalization, which justifies any and all external rules that restrict domestic policy space so as to minimize transactions costs associated with national borders, versus what one might call a democracy-enhancing globalization, which would be more limited than hyperglobalization, and which would impose only those and most likely only procedural restrictions that enhance deliberation or are consistent with democratic delegation. So it's possible to conceive of a globalization that's much more directly targeted at enhancing democracy, but that would have to fall far short of the hyperglobalization according to this trilemma. So let me just stop here and turn it over to Andreas.
Thank you very much, Dani. And I will continue presenting my trilemma before we start entering in dialogue. And I'm very happy for this opportunity to discuss the trilemmas. I've been using your dilemma, Dani, for long in teaching. It has led to rich discussions and has been a very good entry point in problematizing globalization at a time when it was still perceived as a natural and unavoidable process. I've always interpreted your trilemma as an application of Polanyi's double movement, as the necessary containment of hyperglobalization to sustain a democratic policy space. Up to today, the main objection from mainstream policymakers, especially in the international institutions and the European Commission, is to deny its existence. America First rhetorics are seen as exceptions, that is, and especially in the case of the US, that can be overcome, and in this case have been overcome. But this is a distorted, overtly optimistic view of the current conjuncture and the current political situation. Your trilemma shows the necessity of restraining hyperglobalization, even if you are, and that became clear in the presentation, that you are defending another type of globalization. Dismantling these detailed global economic rules, that means neoliberal rulemaking in favor of protecting corporate property and oligopolistic markets, is a prerequisite for progressive change. It is not only necessary if you are sympathetic to a more decentralized polity and selective deglobalization, but also if you are committed to cosmopolitan values and common humanitarian objectives, be it combating climate change or universalizing human rights. What the globalization trilemma and my political trilemma have in common is the conviction that liberal globalism based on hyperglobalization and individualism is, in Polanyian sense, a utopia, and in common sense English, an illusion, a nice but unfeasible idea. However, the globalization trilemma has several weaknesses. First, the three poles, hyperglobalization, nation state, and democracy, and their respective principles are not clearly defined or have evolved over time. Over the years, you yourself have made several contributions in sharpening them. We have a common understanding, the two of us, of hyperglobalization. I will not dwell anymore on this. Also add what you also stress, that it's a type of globalization that favors large corporations and the big players. You define nation state as a proper policy space, which I find a very good definition. And at the beginning defined democracy as mass politics. And I have the impression increasingly over the years, the focus has shifted to equalizing it with liberal democracy, in distinction from what you call electoral democracy like Hungary or Turkey. The problem is, following these specifications, the globalization trilemma is not able to explain current political development. Donald Trump and like-minded autocrats do not fit in the pick 2 out of 3 rule. Trump focused on controlling the nation state as a proper policy space. His strategy consisted in extending control from the executive and legislative to the judiciary, the media, civil society. Total control of national institutions is the first and prime objective. Trump's relationship to globalization and democracy was opportunistic, against or in favor of specific policies depending on his interests. This is a radical version of what in my trilemma is called nationalistic capitalism. This strategy, however, is not restricted to extreme right-wing politicians. There's a broader migration of neoliberals from cosmopolitan positions, brilliantly described by Quinn Slobodian in The Globalists, to nationalistic capitalism as the second best order to protect capitalist institutions. There is, as Mirowski and others have shown, a link between apparent free marketeers, Hayek, and strong state, Carl Schmitt. Not only with Pinochet, the Chilean dictator, has neoliberalism gone hand in hand with an autocratic state. The Austrian Prime Minister, Sebastian Kurz, is emblematic for the strategic shift. His conservative party self-defined itself as the most European party. He himself allied with export-oriented national industrialists. Over the years, however, protecting borders became the core of his populist agenda, leading to a critical stance toward European institutions and the resistance to trade agreements like currently the EU-Mercosur Treaty. Within Austria, recent corruption scandals show that urbanization has already advanced substantially in our country as well. To sum it up, also former neoliberal conservatives adhere to nationalistic capitalism, being opportunistic about globalization and democracy and its respective form. As I show in my article, this is in line with historical development and political philosophy, as there has been a long tradition of supremacist ideology in liberal cosmopolitanism as well. Faced with the anti-egalitarian, anti-liberal, anti-enlightenment shift of these neoliberals, liberal globalists, as I call them, will have to opt between ongoing support for hyperglobalization or joining forces with the only viable alternative to national capitalism that emerges out of the bowl which Dani termed democracy. My trilemma is called the political trilemma of social-ecological transformation because I think that is the challenge of our times. Climate change, the loss of biodiversity, and this redefines the globalization trilemma. If climate research is correct, we are in a process of a new metamorphosis in the Polanyian sense, a profound change of our way of living, working, and producing. And again, as Polanyi did in the Great Transformation, we have to link the long-term analysis in the Great Transformation, the imposition of an industrial market society, to the short-term analysis in the 1930s, the Great Transformation away from liberal capitalism. Today, again, the ongoing transformations will go hand in hand with a redefinition of key political economic concepts like, for example, democracy. I define democracy as a polity of equals, more in tune with Dani's original mass politics definition than with liberal democracy. Therefore, democracy must not be restricted to the political sphere, but extended to the social and economic sphere. There has to be civic participation in shaping the energy, the mobility, the food system. Socio-economic democratization means experimenting with diverse forms of participation, with a mixed economy of cooperatives, municipal state companies, private firms as well. Socioeconomic democratization also means prioritizing the basic, the foundational economic activities that help to, in Polanyi's term, organize the livelihood. This is the objective of the foundational economy, a new approach to build social ecological infrastructures that give access to all. The strategy that I propose in the article, Foundational Economy Based on Planetary Coexistence, is an incipient strategy. There are several open questions. However, it has the merit to pose the challenge for all those opposing the anti-liberal and anti-enlightenment project of nationalistic capitalism, which might become the dominant model of the 21st century, an authoritarian, non-liberal form of capitalism. Alternatives are possible, but they require a focus on foundational goods and services, a perception of the necessity of policy spaces, that means forms of territorial sovereignty, and a multi-scalar strategy of dealing with planetary challenges. It is wrong to assume that the global challenge of social ecological transformation can only be dealt with at the global level. And that's the point where I will leave it for the moment and hand over to Peggy and Dani again.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you, Dani. Before I turn to the Q&A, I do want to turn back to Dani briefly and see if he wants to give a few comments back to Andreas.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you very much, Andreas, for the very interesting presentation, which I largely agree with in terms of its normative discussion. Maybe I'll just make one point of clarification and then one question for you. The point of clarification is that the trilemma, as I have described it, is a description of the outer frontier of possibilities. That is, what you can achieve at most. It doesn't say that if you give up on one of the nodes, you will definitely necessarily have the other two. So in particular, it doesn't mean that if you're, moving away from hyperglobalization, as Donald Trump did, that you would necessarily then have a flourishing democracy at home in a sort of kind of broad participatory liberal democracy sense that we have. So in that sense, it's not meant to be predictive of what would happen necessarily. It's predictive of tensions if you're trying to move simultaneously in all three directions without understanding that that's going to create, kind of the Polanyian kind of reaction to it. And I think probably the best single expression of that I've heard was a former finance minister from the Eurozone who, after I made the presentation of the trilemma and its application to Europe, he basically said, well, that the reason that the radical right wing is winning in Europe is because that they essentially have internalized the trilemma, whereas the centrist groups have always acted as if you could have your cake and eat it too. That is, that you could simultaneously push for a single market in Europe, have a vibrant democracy, but never give up any national sovereignty either. And that's really what to sort of the authoritarian right-wing populists in Europe, and in fact in the United States, Donald Trump, to leverage out of that sort of the tensions and the social backlash that created. The question, I guess, from you, so sort of follows from this is, I mean, again, so my trilemma is not meant to be normative. It's meant to be sort of, these are the constraints we face. My sense is that your trilemma is much more explicitly normative, and in that sense also very clearly, favors us to move in one particular direction, right? So is that, would that be a fair description of your trilemma?
Thank you for this question, and thank you for your first comment as well, because that helps me to give the answer. Yeah? I think that the European politician that you cite, I would totally agree, and that's why I would call this attempt to say there are no contradictions as illusionary, and that for quite some time has been the common mainstream response to the trilemma and the contradictions that you mentioned. And if you don't acknowledge these contradictions, and that's not normative, that's analytical, you are lost. And I would argue, and in this sense, my trilemma is, I would argue, is analytical and normative, and they both are intertwined in the sense of, I find it really worrying how this pole of nationalistic capitalism is emerging, and the term was an invention when I tried to come to terms with Donald Trump and others that were neoliberals, and then you read books about neoliberalism, and at the core it's always pro-globalization, and suddenly the core is the strong nationalist attempts and the control of the state, while you read in definition of neoliberalism, neoliberalism is anti-statist. So I think that the analytical sharpening of the what is nationalistic capitalism an analytical merit. And then talking, and here the normative dimension comes. What are feasible strategies? I try to argue that the conventional idea of liberal globalism is not the answer. And we have to find another one, and then that's the pole of foundational economy. But in this sense, I think here I'm quite a lot inspired by your arguments on hyperglobalization and its limits. And I see it very often. Take the 2016 election in the US, but there was an identical election in Austria where we had a right winger going for president. And the debate was good globalization and openness and open-mindedness. That goes hand in hand. On the other hand, provincial nationalism, and the debate was between these spatial constructs. And I find this analytically and politically a horrible confrontation. And secondly, one that those in favor of globalization will always lose. So in this sense, my trilemma is both.
Can I follow up maybe just to deepen our conversation a bit, and also maybe get a little bit more concrete, because we're talking about sort of rather conceptually. So let me mention two concrete ways in which the current policy discussions seem to be moving us away from hyperglobalization, and largely in ways that I would argue would expand the space for democracy at the national level. So one of them is the discussion on carbon border adjustments with respect to carbon taxes. The other is the discussion on corporate taxation. So with respect to carbon taxes, as you know, in Europe, there's a lot of discussion about having a European system of carbon taxation, robust system of carbon taxation, but to ensure through essentially what are in fact tariffs at the border, to ensure that domestic firms that face high carbon prices would not be competitively undermined through imports from low carbon tax or no carbon tax jurisdictions abroad. So essentially, it's imposing effectively a kind of an equalization charge at the border to ensure that even firms abroad are facing effectively higher price for carbon, at least when they operate in our own jurisdiction. So it's very explicitly sort of raising barriers at the border to ensure that our own domestic regulations with respect to the environment and climate change are not being undermined. I will open a parenthesis here and say that if you're willing to do this, let's say for the environment and for climate change, there's a question as to why you would not think of something similar with respect to social standards and labor standards, to the extent that your unions, their power, their collective bargaining, or your minimum wages or your labor protections are being undermined because of competition with jurisdictions where labor rights are not protected. Wouldn't there be, in fact, a similar argument for an equalization charge as well? I realize that opens up a very huge conundrum, but it seems to me to be conceptually sort of similar. The other issue is, of course, it's international corporate taxation, the idea that we should have at least a global minimum of corporate taxation, but then countries can go above that if they want by simply topping up their own corporations and so forth. It's again, in some sense, stepping back from hyperglobalization, because it is saying, no, you can't essentially attract foreign corporations or foreign corporations headquarters by having sort of low taxes. But it is saying that it's giving us a room to have our own sort of corporate taxes at a level that our own democracy desires. Are those, in your view, sort of movements in the right direction? Where do you see, the areas where we need to move much more if we want to go into this direction of what you call the foundational economy?
May I answer, Margaret? Margaret?
Yes, go ahead, and then we'll turn to the Q&A.
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much for the two examples. They help me to clarify even further. First, we have the leading economist in our research institution, and he is a liberal globalist criticizing the carbon tax, how do you call it, border tax, yeah? But the conservative prime minister is in favor of it. So it's a very clear example where nationalistic capitalism and the concrete interest of European capital and the foundational economy have something in common. The same prime minister would never be in favor of uniform labor legislation if this might imply any disadvantage for his industry and his allies. So in this sense, yes, and it shows also the shifting attitude of business in some of the European countries, at least. The second policy suggestion is the idea of a better globalization, and that really entered in the revision of my text. That if this is possible, it's very much welcome for the foundational economy. Whatever regulations, if the ILO standards would be universalized, if there are tax havens restricted, all this would be very much supported. The problem is that in the current situation of geopolitical rivalry, I doubt whether too many of such global regulations are possible. But if they are possible, they would be very much in tune with foundational economy within planetary coexistence.
Okay, thank you, Andreas. I'm going to turn to the Q&A, and I'm going to read one or two questions at a time, since others in the audience cannot actually see the questions. So first, a comment from Peter Kirby. Hello, Peter, who has argued, or let me just read directly. I argue, this is Peter, that there is a similar trilemma between capitalism, climate action, and reduction of inequality. In other words, the dominant greening capitalist agenda can only succeed at the expense, particularly of reducing inequality, while if it's seriously addressed inequality, it would create great difficulties for meeting climate goals. The question is, any responses to this alternative trilemma? Andreas, you want to go first, and then Dani. Or it's not necessary. Whichever of you would like to jump into that one.
What is part of my trilemma, differently from Dani's, is exactly that the current conjuncture in my reading is poses much more serious questions with respect to capitalism and the viability of finding good solutions within this framework, and all the difficulties in going beyond. Indeed, I think the issue of inequality is a crucial issue, and all the recent and better research on climate change stresses inequality is a core reason for our current problems. So reducing them and tackling the climate action implies dismantling capitalist institutions. In this sense, I agree. Perhaps to add this one point that links also to Dani, the way forward for sure has to do with industrial policy as well within the policy space. But reducing the sector of tradable goods. All research indicates that certain sectors of the economy will have to shrink. And if it's not the foundational economy, it has to be the tradable sector. So the tradable sector has to become greener, but probably also smaller.
Dani, did you want to respond to that?
I mean, I would add that, that I think capitalism is actually a very flexible and malleable system that as long as we conceive of what's required to decarbonize and green our economies as, not being, very strictly sort of carbon taxes and a very neoliberal arm's length model of regulation, that it's entirely possible to combine an agenda of decarbonization and greening with an agenda of creation of good jobs and propping up incomes of the lower middle classes and middle classes in the advanced countries, therefore simultaneously pursuing the agendas of green economy and a more inclusive economy. I take that to be the main objective of, for example, in the United States, the Green New Deal. The European, Green Deal is, I think, is much narrower. Doesn't have the social labor markets agenda that I think a true Green Deal would need to have. But I do think it's possible to combine through sort of some version of the kind of industrial policies that Andreas mentioned, that uses the right pricing of carbon, but needs to go beyond that if you want to really make it a more inclusive and serving the agenda of equality kind of a policy for climate change.
Thank you. We have less than 15 minutes left, so I'm going to ask you both to answer as quickly as possible. Let me combine two questions that are specifically for Dani. First one is from Margie Mendel, which is a very particular question. Dani, is the current proposal by Janet Yellen regarding minimum corporate taxation, is that a movement in this regard? And can you see that happening? And another question, also specifically for you, from Samuel Oloruntuba, is, and by the way, everyone is prefacing with thank you to both of you for great presentations. Samuel's question is, under the neoliberal orthodoxy currently, the state is regarded as merely tangential to economic development. But each time the market fails, the state becomes useful in bailing out the too big to fail corporations. How can the state be restructured to be more responsive to providing public goods to citizens rather than serving the interests of the market?
Thank you for both questions. As I mentioned earlier, I do think that the global minimum corporate income tax proposal from the US administration is sort of stepping back from hyperglobalization in order to expand the space for the state to be democratically more responsible to its domestic agenda. So in that way, I think it's desirable. I think my ideal system would be one where there is a relatively low global corporate minimum tax that ensures that the most harmful forms of corporate tax competition, those of true tax havens, is eliminated. But you don't at the same time necessarily reduce the ability of jurisdictions like Singapore or Ireland or Netherlands, who for their own reasons, maybe they have less need for public revenue, maybe they have other reasons to value low corporate income taxes. You don't necessarily take away their own ability to set corporate taxes that are lower than what exists in the rest of Europe or in the United States. Such a system would still allow high tax jurisdictions to apply higher corporate tax rate for their own corporations, regardless of where they operate. So essentially, Singapore might say, I want a very low corporate tax rate, but I can't necessarily impose it on subsidiaries of foreign corporations because they'll still get taxed at a higher rate in their home jurisdiction. But if I don't have any real need, so I'm not using low corporate taxes simply to steal investment from some other places, I shouldn't really mind having lost that investment. So I think we need to work this into this kind of a balance between having reasonable global rules, but that doesn't necessarily constrain the ability of countries that have legitimate reasons, not pure tax shifting reasons, for having their own separate and different levels of corporate taxes. On the role of the state, I mean, I think absolutely. I mean, I think it's got to be. The answer has got to be we need ideas and we need political mobilization and political pressure. And I think it's with both that we will get the state be more responsive to the ordinary citizen. I do think it's changing. It's changing in the United States very fast. I mean, Joe Biden is as centrist a politician as you can imagine, and yet his current agenda has gone way beyond what anybody who would consider herself or himself progressive 4 years ago or even 2 years ago would have had on their agenda. So I think things are changing.
We can only hope. A question from Jerome Nikolai Warren, and this is he would like to hear more about different visions of democracy. As Andreas said, there are many definitions, each with their own connotations and derivations. Can Polanyi help us discover where democracy needs to be headed in the post-COVID world? I'll throw that out to both of you.
To start with, I mean, Dani, and in the article you can read this, has written several articles, and there is this widespread necessity to distinguish between electoral democracies, because you have election in nearly every country of the world, and it's very doubtful whether Russia is a democracy, and a democracy in Turkey and Hungary. They are openly, in the case of Hungary, not liberal democracies. On the other hand, you have a long left tradition to be critical of liberal democracy and arguing that democracy has to go beyond this, as I argue in favor of dealing with the everyday needs and life of people, democratizing society. I think this is an urgent task. But on the other hand, and that's the lesson that we should have learned over the last years, defending liberal democracy is the minimum program. And one should be very cautious of talking badly about liberal democracy with all its shortcomings, but checks and balances, independent judiciarity, all these are prerequisites for then democratizing one step further. But democratizing one step further is the Polanyian vision. It's freedom in a complex society. And that freedom would be a positive freedom in the sense of being able to shape one's life, environment, community, polity.
Dani, did you want to respond to that one?
No, I agree very much with Andreas. I mean, I do think that, I think it's become somewhat, around among progressive circles to sort of poo-poo liberal democracy and things like, the rule of law and separation of powers but it's when you lose them, as countries like Turkey and Russia have, and Hungary losing, that you really understand how important and foundational those things are. So it's absolutely important that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. That those there are minimal requirements, but they're very hard to sustain. So it's very. I think beyond that, I absolutely agree that we need to have a richer imagination of what democracy is. I mean, I think I'm an economist, so my angle on this has been to really think about what are the economic preconditions that will be more conducive to a more richer and more vibrant democracies, or put it in somewhat, in the other way around, what kind of economic problems will make it much more difficult to sustain a healthy, vibrant democracy. And I see the key problem there as being our the disappearance of good jobs. Labor market polarization in the advanced countries is essentially the key economic structural problem that is making it very difficult, the maintenance of healthy, vibrant democracy. So a lot of my work is really trying to understand how we can create new models of economic management that will focus particularly on the increasing the supply of good jobs, middle-class jobs, and in that way sort of goes beyond the traditional welfare state with a much more productivist orientation.
Thank you. Okay, I wish I could get to all the questions. There's a lot more, but I'm just going to try and jam in two last ones and give you each just a second or two to respond. One is about the state in Africa. And this question says that the state is typically weak in Africa in terms of mobilizing resources and relating with more advanced countries in trade negotiations. Many of them are currently dealing with non-state actors that are challenging their legitimacy. What do you see as the future of these states in an emerging global order? And the second question, different question, is if we are moving away from hyperglobalization, does that mean a new Bretton Woods is again possible? So each of you gets 1.5 minutes to answer.
Shall I? Okay, maybe I'll just jump in.
Sure. Go for it.
On the state in Africa, yes, I agree. But I would also emphasize that state capacity is endogenous. That is to say that state capacity is built, and it's built on the basis of having a project, a vision, a good set of priorities. And so I think the problems of the state in Africa are as much the absence of a vision and prioritization and a project as much as it is just lack of resources. I think so. We need to understand that it's not something that we have to resign ourselves to. On the question about the new Bretton Woods, it's very hard to imagine how, absent a major world war or something like that, that we can have something like Bretton Woods. It was such a unique moment in history. But I think we're likely to find ourselves that we will be moving ourselves into a new set of arrangements. Somewhere down the line, somebody like John Ruggie or another Keynes will come and they'll rename whatever we've managed to come about, and hopefully it'll be something good rather than something bad.
Andreas?
Just to jump in here, I mean, one has to be aware of that Bretton Woods went hand in hand with the Cold War, and I think this way, I would argue we should try to avoid a new Cold War and polarization, and that will not be an easy task given current tensions. So that would be my first answer. And the second answer is I've done a lot of work on Brazil. I'm not an expert on Africa. And until some 5-10 years ago, I was very optimistic that development from below is possible. The last weeks, and showing the way how the Brazilian model of moderate reforms by Lula and others has been destroyed deliberately, reinforces my hopes that this might be a way forward by delinking from some of the imperial links, because what has become clear, just to end this, is the bad role of the US in fostering the developments over the last years in Brazil. So in this sense, yes, there is chance, and I think weakening hyperglobalization is a means forward to allow greater policy space, and that can go in both directions, but in the global south, there is also potential for improvement.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you so much to both Dani and to Andreas. Thank you to all of you who asked questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them. And that officially ends this session. And I think there's a 15-minute break before the next one. So thank you all again.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you all.
Thank you very much.